Well, a product of Buffalo, Oklahoma, Gary McManus has seen firsthand the economic impact drought can have. A perspective he says he never forgets as our state's climatologist. Our Andy Barth sat down with Gary after he spoke at this year's Ag Weather Symposium.
Well, so Gary, we've had some good rains here, but are we out of the drought?
Well, now some parts of the state are out of drought, especially across southeastern into east central Oklahoma. They've had really good rains throughout, the last 6 to 9 months. So they haven't been in as bad situation as other parts of the state. But unfortunately, most of the state still remains in drought. It's not quite the severity that we've seen over the last few years with these summer rains and late spring rains that we've seen. But that drought does still exist, and it's mostly due to the long-term impacts.
Okay, so what can Oklahoma expect going forward?
Well, August is always hot and dry, it seems like, so it's not a shock that we've entered a hot and dry August period. Now, as we get into the fall, though, that's our secondary rainy season, and as we get later into September, into October, early November, that's generally when we see a higher rate of rainfall and higher amounts. The spring is definitely our rainiest part of the year, but there is a secondary rainy season in the fall. And, if we look at the outlooks from the Climate Prediction Center, they're actually seeing increased odds of a wetter than normal fall, which would be wonderful to continue the drought relief that we've seen over the last few months.
Mm-hmm. Well, we've seen definitely kind of this yo-yo effect when it comes to the drought. And in terms of agriculture, what does this roller coaster effect have on the industry?
Well, it's a lot of chaos for folks trying to determine when they should plant, what they should plant, when they plant, are they actually going to be able to get a crop up? So if you get all your rainfall from, let's say, late May through July, that doesn't really help you if you're wanting to plant wheat in September or October, because you need rains then. And if you want cotton, rains in September or October don't help you when you want to plant later in the next year. So it's just a lot of chaos, and it's hard to determine when it's so variable the way it's been over the last 4 or 5 years, exactly what sort of actions agriculture should take. And that's the worst thing, is not knowing what it's going to do specifically, because you're used to seeing rains in the fall, rains in the spring, a hot summer, a cold winter, and that's really hasn't worked out over the last few years.
Well, and even with those variations in the temperature and the weather, within this tight-knit industry, it doesn't work for everybody at the same time.
Right, exactly. And so you can't, it's very difficult to say, well, this is not working for me, I'm going to switch to something else. Just look at the amount of, cattle loss from the state over the last 4 years. And because we've had really good periods of rain throughout the 4 years, even though we've been in an overall drought situation, but the cattle have not come back. And that's simply because it's been such a chaotic period. You cannot get enough rainfall for a long enough period of time to really have the confidence to build those herds back up.
Well, and you mentioned, we've had some rains in this long-term drought situation, but a long-term drought doesn't mean constant drought.
Right, even during some of our most severe droughts in our history, the 30s drought, the 50s drought, there were periods of really good rains, and that's what we've seen during this 4-year drought cycle. If you look at the eastern half of the state, they've been in and out of drought about half the time, so pretty equal for those folks. If you look at the western half of the state, they've pretty much been in drought for the entire 4-year period. So it does come and go with the rains. But in overall, though, those long-term drought impacts tend to stick around. And so if you get a dry period crop up, you just accelerate right back into drought much more rapidly than you would normally.
Is there any indication that man has had something to do with these drought conditions?
Not just yet. Now, of course, the long-term, what they call climate change, all the assessments and the science do point towards the possibility of droughts increasing in frequency and severity as we go through the next century, really here, through the end of this century, across the southern plains. And we are seeing a long-term drought that we haven't seen for a while, but we've had those long-term droughts in our past. So really to determine, I think, if this is the beginning of something due to climate change, you're just going to have to wait and see what the science looks at as we get into the future and look back at this climate period, this drought period, Was this the beginning of a long-term change to where we had more droughts and more severe droughts? Or is this just another part of our normal drought wet cycle that we've seen in the Great Plains?
Well, looking forward, is there any good news?
The good news is we do have that possibility for fall rainfall and also the possibility for a wetter than normal fall, which would take the drought relief we've seen during the summer, which was very uncharacteristic for Oklahoma, and continue it into the fall months. And then we also have the possibility of an El Nino. Now, if that El Nino is a strong or even a moderate strength El Nino, we could see some, again, a wet October through March period, which would continue that drought relief. But if it's a weak one, we might want to watch out for a dry October through March because that does tend to happen if it's a weak El Nino. So first we need to get this El Nino to develop, and then we need it to be a strong El Nino.
All right, well, Gary McManus, thank you so much.
You bet, my pleasure.